Hi, this is Alex from phpacademy.org with a video tutorial for the new Boston. In this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at the slider in jQuery UI. What we're going to do is we're going to implement a simple slider onto the page and take a look at some of the options that are available to us. So when the slider is in operation, we're going to create a div underneath the slider that's going to hold the div, and we're going to feed back the values associated with the slider. So this is useful for things like if you've looked at clothing websites or other websites you have, such as just retail websites. You may have sliders that allow you to pick a particular value in the range of a particular value. For example, in currency you would have a slider that would allow you to only show items between certain amounts of money. So sliders can be implemented in this way. Obviously we're not going to be looking at it in too much detail in this tutorial by just demonstrating this slider effect or slider widget in jQuery UI, but we're just going to take a look at some of the options available, some of the more useful options. So the first thing we want to do is actually implement a slider into our page. So I've included obviously all the necessary includes that we've been using throughout the tutorial series. But the first thing I'm going to do is go over to style.css and just style some of the body elements, or one of the body elements, which is the font size. And I'm going to set this to 14 pixels. I'm also going to be setting the size of the slider a bit later on. We're going to be fiddling around with this during the tutorial. But for now I'm just going to leave that blank until we implement the slider. So the slider we're going to place into a div element on our page. I'm just going to call this slider, and underneath I'm going to have an area where we have the slider value. So I'm just going to call this div slider value. So the slider is going to be implemented in here, and the value associated with the slider will go into this div here. So if we go over to ui.js, which I've included on my page, we can start to actually activate the slider. So we're going to reference using a selector this slider div here. So we'll go ahead and write slider in there, and then we just want to write .slider. Now this will automatically activate the slider, and we can view it on our page. So yeah, that should be slider. So let's go ahead and refresh our page, and you can see that we've got a basic slider with no minimum or maximum value, and we're also not feeding back the value to the user. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is actually feeding back the value. So inside the options we're going to set an event based on the slider value. So the event name is slide, so if we just write slide in here, we can create a function associated with this. So we'll come down a couple of lines. Let's just pop this on a separate line altogether. Down here. Okay, so when we're actually taking the slider and dragging it across this bar, anything inside here we want to feed back. So this function here is going to take two parameters, which is event and UI. Now we're not going to be looking at event, but we're going to be looking at UI, which is obviously going to feed back the value of the bar. So I'll show you how to do that just now. Now we're going to select our slider value div, and we're going to place some text inside there. We can use HTML or text. If you're putting anything else other than like you might want to go ahead and implement a pound sign, for example. Let's just do that to test, and then you want to append on UI.value. Now we're going to be changing this a bit later on with the other options that we're going to give it, because value isn't going to work for values in between. So you'll understand a bit later on that we'll go ahead and change this and access it as an array. But for now what's going to happen is we've set up the slider. When we slide, we run this current function, and from UI we place the value of the slider into the slider value with a pound sign on the front of it. So let's go ahead and refresh. You can see that as we slide, this is now updating, so you can see that the value is increasing. By default it's from 0, so back to 0 here, all the way up to 100. Now because we're going to be setting values a bit later and using these in several places, what I want to do is just go up here and set a few of these values into variables. So I'm going to set the min value equal to 1. We want the value to always start at 1, and I'm going to set the max value to 400. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually implement these as options. So the two options we're looking at here is min and max. So just under here I can write min, and I can go ahead and put min value. So now min will be equal to 1, so the slider will always start at 1, and max we can use max value. And remember this comma here, because this comma separates this option value here from this slide here. It would usually look like that. So now that we've set a min and a max, we can go ahead and check that. You can see that it will have started at 1, and as we go all the way up, it's now at a maximum value of 400. So that's essentially how we are setting the minimum and maximum values of our slider, which is almost always going to be the case. We might not want 0 to 100, we might want a larger value. So assuming this is pounds, we have an option from £1 to £400. So this could be a slider, for example, I don't know, how much money do you want to borrow, or how much money would you like to donate, or anything like that. There is another option that we can use called step, which will step at an incremental point in the slider. So for example, if we only wanted multiples of 5, what we could do is we could set a step value. So I could set the step value to 5, for example, and what's going to happen here is when we actually increment it, it's going to go up with a value of 5. So you'll notice at the moment that we're going up in 5 because we started at 1, so we could either change this to 0 or we could step at 4.